where if it is equal to channel 2, it's going to control roughness of one value versus roughness of another. This will make sense in just a moment. Actually, I can leave this as being between 0 and 1. So we've got those, we've created them. I'm now going to go ahead and duplicate what we have, and I'm going to rename them. Make sure you rename these before modifying them, otherwise it'll modify the same titled assets, nodes. So we've got channel 1, and I'm going to set this to be using blue. And if I stop preview, what we should see, if I look at it from this point onwards, is we've got channel 1 has that, channel 2 has a separate roughness. So if I go apply and save, this is going to come through here at the moment, but if I look closely, I can see that that outside there has a separate color. Do you see how that's getting kind of a shine to it because the roughness values are different? Let's go on and actually improve that a bit and use this asset here as a way of deciding which color is which. So whatever comes out of this controls decal color 1 and decal color 2. So if I plug that in to here, A and B, then I'm going to just preview this node so I can see it a bit better. If this was to be dropped down to here, we'd now see that the Unreal logo would be black and the outside would be white. So if I apply and drop this into the world, you'll see that we get that. If anything, I actually kind of want the opposite of this though. I want to have a shiny black metallic for the outside and an interior that looks a little bit nicer. So I'm going to swap these values around. I'm going to push you up to be white, and I'm going to dial you back to be black. Which is then going to give me that. So we can then use this as just a basic logo that's kind of in the world. I can have this however I want it to be. Some very basic stuff. But these decals are very, very useful because they let us do some really interesting things. If I go to here and I show you the blend mode, you can see that these are all the parameters that we can change in different ways. Now, the color and normal and roughness are incredibly useful because it means you can use decals to add just a very subtle bump to the surface. So I could make it look like a hatch was hidden away there that was just slightly difficult to see. You know, I can add all sorts of additional lighting details that normally wouldn't be there. So this is very useful, and I strongly recommend messing around with them in your various projects. This was obviously just a very quick approach to it, but it's enough that hopefully you can see where the power of it is. I'm going to just set these up to be a little bit bigger, U to 0.1, and I'm just going to put this up on the top. And that's it for the basics of that project. We've now gone and added various bells and whistles, and we have ourselves a simple game. The final thing that we're going to be doing is working on the user interface and just extending it a little bit further so that we have some nice animations for things as they take place. So let's look at polishing up UMG, so making our UI substantially better. At the moment, if I click play, that's what we have. And it's not really that pretty. Really what we want to do is make sure that anything that's in there has like a nice level of polish. So what I'm going to go about doing is setting up a main menu that actually looks reasonably good. So this time around, I want you to go to your assets folder and create a new subfolder. So I'm going to right click, new folder. I'm going to call this UI. And I'm going to import these from my textures UI folder. So both of these, just drag them in and import them. Now you can see that we've got two textures here. One is the back plate, so that's what we're going to have for the core of the main menu. And the other section is simply the logo itself. And I want you to double click on each of these and set the texture group to be UI. Save. Double click, UI, save. So now that that's good, let's go to Blueprints, and I'm going to open up the main menu. Now, the first way that people would think of adding a backplate to this would be to make sure that, they could just drag an image and hope that it all works. However, that's not actually a good way to do this. If I was to drag in an image and just drop it there, and I was to set the image to be the backplate, even if I checked size to content and ramped the size of this thing up, it's not a good way to handle this. And the reason being is that according to the screen resolution and everything else, it's going to resize itself in different ways. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's say I put this here and I set this up so that, the scale was reasonably close to what I had, and I just popped that there. If I was to change the screen to, say, an iPhone, it would now be all the way over here. If I was to change it to a MacBook, it would be sitting here. So different screen sizes have different consequences for where it's going to end up. And the way for us to fix that is to initially, I'm going to drag this so that the Y's kind of match. At which point I'm going to go to this and I'm going to set the anchor to be this one just here. Now I can see that this isn't correctly scaled, but that's okay. What I need to do is tell it that the position offset for X is equal to 0, which will position this left-hand side of it perfectly with the middle. At which point, if I go down to my alignment and I say X is equal to 0.5, this will now automatically put this in the middle, which is nice. Now the other thing that I'm going to do is you can see that we have offset top and we have offset bottom, and I've just zeroed out both of those values. Now the next thing to get this working is to right click on this and go to wrap with and set the wrap width to be a scale box. Now a scale box is fantastic because essentially what it lets us do is tell it to automatically fill the y-axis wherever it can and then scale the x-axis accordingly. And to do that, what we need to do is under vertical alignment, I'm going to click on this button here that says vertically align the fill, and I'll show you what that looks like. If I was to go screen size and change it to something that was in portrait, you can see that the menu is now stretching all the way to the top. However, it does have another issue, and that other issue is that this section here is not being correctly stretched accordingly. Notice how the x-axis is quite thin and that's not actually circular, it's more of an oval. So for us to fix that, all we need to do is go to our scale box, and under here where it says stretch scale to fit, we just tell it to scale to fit the y-axis. And now you can see that the x and the y are kept in line with one another, and it looks a lot nicer no matter the screen size. So if I change the screen size to any other device, that's always going to look reasonably consistent. So next up, what we need to do is get our scale box. I'm just going to drag it to the top here so that it's the backing. But it's time for us to look at UMG animations. So for a UMG animation, we're going to create a logo that upon launching is going to resize itself onto the screen. So let's look at how to go about doing that. First off, I'm going to get rid of this pinball game text because we're going to be replacing this with an actual logo. So I'm going to delete this, and instead I'm going to drag in an image, and I'm going to get this image and I'm going to tell it that the anchor point is going to be based off of the top center, because that's always where I want the logo to end up. And I'm going to tell the brush to have an image that is the logo. And I can type in the word logo for us to find it. You'll notice that, it's automatically kind of done this. A nice way for us to handle this is I can go size to content, and you can see this will automatically pick up the size. The alternative is, instead of doing size to content, I can just tell it that the size X and size Y are given values. So as long as I make sure those are square, we should end up with something that looks like what we want. Now for this, I kind of want to have this sitting about here. So it's going to kind of sit a little off-centered, and then we'll eventually have the play button down here and a full high scores list. 500 by 500 looks okay. I might up it to something that's a bit easier to work out a downsampled version. So I've changed it to 512 purely because the texture itself is a 2048 by 2048. And if I divide that number by 4, which is a nice clean value, I get 512, which creates a slightly nicer image when we've made it smaller. So I've put it there as a 512, at which point I'm going to go ahead and quickly animate this to appear, and then we'll start looking at fixing up the play button and the high scores button. So initially what I need to do is I need to get this image and I need to add an animation for it. So the best way to think of animations is set your initial scene up as to how you want it to end up as, and then when you go to create an animation, you kind of work backwards from that. So I've clicked on the Unreal Pinball, and I'm now going to add an animation, and I'm going to call this new animation Intro. Now within this, I could theoretically change any of the values for any of the assets that are currently in the scene. An animation isn't tied to a single section, like it could be the entire menu is animated in different ways. For the time being, I'm just going to focus on this logo though. So to do that, what I need to do is I need to add the image. Now you'll notice that at the moment we haven't really been naming any of these things very well. So I'm going to go back to this image and I'm going to click F2 and I'm just going to rename this to be menu logo. So now when I go back to add, you'll notice that we have menu logo as an option. So by adding menu logo here, I can now click on this add track button. And the track that we want is the transformation track. So if I click on that, what I'm actually able to do is set up keyframes that allow me to change its transformation values, so its translation, rotation, scale, and the shear. We're going to ignore shear for the time being. I can change those on the fly to do different things, and I'll show you what that means. If I was, for instance, to go to my scale, and I was to select up here at about the 1 second mark, and I was to add a keyframe, you can see that it's added the 2 keyframes here. So what we're going to be doing here is initially we have 2 values of 1 and 1. I'm just going to drag this all the way back to this initial frame, and I'm going to select this, and I'm just going to set this value to 0 and this value to 0 as well. And you'll notice that now, if I was to play this animation, the pinball logo just goes from 0 scale to scaling up to create something like that. Now, it's a good idea when you're doing these kind of things to kind of add a little bit of a pop. So to do that, all I'm going to do is at this point, so at 0.9 seconds in, I'm actually going to set the scale to be 1.2 and 1.2. And what this means is it kind of gets big and then goes small again. So that's initially what we've got, and this is already set to be a cubic interpolation, which is nice. So that gives it a nice kind of smooth in, smooth out. But if you wanted to, you could set it to linear as well, which is another common way of interpolating variables. I'm also going to get these 2 keyframes, and I'm just going to kind of move them across just a little bit so I can position them to get kind of a quicker pop. Actually, I might move this way instead. Yeah, that looks a lot nicer. So you can see it goes pop and then comes back down. Great. So that's our initial intro. And if I was to hit compile, save, we wouldn't see that when we played the asset initially, and I'll show you why. So if I go to my pinball game and I hit play, you can see that we had the menu and we had the logo, but nothing played. And the reason for that is rather simple. If I go to my graph and I go to the section that says construct, construct is kind of like the widget version of begin play. So if I get the construct and I was to get the animation reference, you can see it's over here, and drag that in. So I get that. I can now call play animation. And if I was to plug this in, compile, save, you can see that on launch, it just played the intro animation, and we had something rather nice. So there's a couple of different ways that we could do this. If I wanted to, for instance, I could go about setting up the main menu to have the middle section slide in, scale in, do whatever wonderful things we wanted. But for the time being, I kind of just wanted that logo to be correct. That's all we need to kind of get some basic animation. If I wanted to go to my intro, I'm able to add new assets to this. So I could get the background plate and add things there too. And I probably will do that once everything is completely 100% set up as a final push, but I'm going to hold off for just the time being. Instead, next we're going to focus on adding fonts. So instead of using this standard Unreal Engine Roboto font, we're going to put in something new. And I should stress here that one of the most telltale signs that a project is still in the prototyping phase is that all of the fonts are still set to Roboto. It's just one of those things you start picking the more you see Unreal Engine projects. So it's a good idea to kind of give it a nice level of polish, to kind of move away from that as early as you can. So we're going to look at that for the next lesson. For this lesson, we're going to be looking at adding fonts. So instead of using the standard Roboto font that we have on this play button, we're going to have something new. Now the font that I've selected for us to use for the standard menus and everything else is going to be the font in our pinball assets called League Gothic. And I'm going to be using League Gothic Condensed Italic as my standard font here. So this is a free font available from the League of Movable Type. And to add this, I'm just going to go to my content browser, Assets, UI, and I'm going to drag in the condensed italic font. So just drag in, and this will create a font. Now it should be noted that up until version 4.14, this is what will happen. However, in version 4.15 onwards, it will create a slightly different import in which it will create two font types, a font face and the font itself. Don't be too alarmed, just be aware that you need to use the font face if you're in version 4.15 or above. So I've clicked on this, and I'm going to go back to my main menu, and I'm initially just going to select this play text that we've already created. And you'll see that the font is now available as an option. However, we do have a bit of an issue. If you look at this, you can see that the font has automatically clipped on the left and the right hand side. So to fix this, all we need to do is set this up in a way that's going to make sure that this button is the correct size given the font. So to be clear, this issue is brought on by the fact that it's italic and it's a slightly larger than average character. If I go to this section down here that says minimum desired width, I can actually increase the size of this box. Now it's not going to do anything until it hits the minimum level of where the characters would be, at which point it'll start to increase in size. So in this situation, I'm just going to increase it to about here, and then I'm going to change the justification to be centered. And you'll notice that this is now correctly in position here. Now the next thing that I want to do is I want to set it so that we can't see this button. I want all the functionality of the button, but I don't want this button to be something that's anywhere near as ugly as this. So what I'm going to do is select it, and I'm going to go to the style box. And in the style box, I'm going to set the normal tint, and under here you'll see we have RGBA. I'm just going to set the A to be off, and the other one that I care about is hovered. So again, tint, I'm going to set that to off, and finally when it's pressed, tint, I'm going to set this to off. Now you may be wondering, yeah, but how are we going to know if something is hooked up and selected? But that's okay. What I can do now is I can get this play button, and if I scroll down to the button itself, if I scroll down, there's on hovered. So I'm going to click on that, and we now have an on hovered event. What I'm going to do is on hovered, I'm going to increase the shadow of the play button. Now the other option I have here is I could either increase the shadow by just setting the variable, or alternatively, I could actually create an animation that changed the text whenever we do it. So I think the nicest way is, since we want to kind of blend in the shadow and blend out the shadow, I'm actually going to set this up so that the play button, first off, let's just quickly position this button itself to be in a spot that we want it to be. I'm going to set it just here. Just going to turn that off for the moment so I don't grab it. And I'm going to get the play button, and I'm just going to put this about here. Okay, we're going to get the play button, and first off we're going to name this to be something that's a bit easier to recognize. So play button text. I'm going to add an animation which is going to be called play hover, and all I'm going to do is add play button text. The first track I'm going to add is going to be shadow color, and then the next track that I'm going to add is offset. That way we can control how dark the shadow is and how far it's offset. And all I'm going to do is, in shadow color, I'm going to say that at the 0 mark, all of the values are normal, which have been automatically added. But at the 0.3 mark, let's go ahead and add a keyframe and set this opacity value to be 1. So you can see that it gets a little bit of darkness underneath it. However, we do have another issue, which is that the shadow is kind of close to the object. So at the moment the shadow offset is set to 1. But if I was to go over here and I was to change this value, you can see that we can kind of push where these values end up. So I'm just going to push this across to about 6.2, and I'm going to push this up as well. And now if I was to look at how that runs, when you highlight the button with play, it's going to look like that. So in my graph, all I'm going to do is drag in play hover, and if I go play animation, you can now see that if I was to drag this on hovered, we're going to play the highlight animation. I'm going to compile and save. Play. And what we've shown here is that yes, it works, but we need one other thing to be set up for this to really work correctly. And that is, we need this to play backwards on unhover. So if I was to get the button again and scroll down, and this time do an on unhovered, I'm now going to just copy and paste the code that I already have for play animation, and this time set it to play in reverse. Now, that is correctly playing and then playing backwards, but we have one last thing that we need to change, which is we need to kind of pause it when we get to that section of the animation. If I was to click on this Unreal logo and scroll to this behavior section, you see we have visibility. What's essentially happening is the reason it was kind of jittering on and off is that when I selected this region of the button, it would turn on. But because my mouse was coming from here and across, it would then unselect it because it was now trying to select this Unreal Pinball logo instead. So if I go to visibility, I can actually set this to be hit test invisible, which means that the art is still there, but it no longer gets in the way of my cursor. So I'm going to set that to be hit test invisible and compile, save, and now I'm going to hit play. And you can see that all works. So we now have the ability to highlight the play button and everything will be set up. So the next thing that I'm going to do is show you how to set up the high scores in the same way, and we'll move through that video in just a second. So it's time for us to add some particles to this project, and after that I'm going to let the project be, because it's up to you to kind of go out and create your own custom variations from here. But the last thing that I really want to leave you with is the ability to add some simple particle effects so you can have some kind of cooler stuff happening within your environment. So to do this, what I'm going to do is right click and I'm going to create a new particle system, and this is just going to be called P underscore bumper sparks. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a simple particle system that's going to like explode sparks out of the bumpers, so out of these, every time they're hit. And I think the best way for us to do that is to kind of generate a ring of sparks that are going to shoot out from here and then out around the world. So there's a couple of different ways that we could do this, but to begin with, what I would personally recommend doing is creating a ring and then we go from there. So the nicest way to handle that is initially I want you to delete your initial velocity, right click, and go down to location. And I know location may not seem like the best starting place, but there's a reason for it, I swear. So sphere, click, and what we're going to do is essentially this initially creates particles popping in and generating them as a sphere. So you can see here that they're in roughly a spherical shape. If I turn my spawn rate up, you can see that they're all just popping into the shape of a sphere. But I don't actually really want that. I want a ring. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to disable positive Z. So now we have only half of a sphere, which is the bottom half. And I'm going to disable negative Z. So we now have them all just spawning within here. But the final thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go surface only, which means only spawn things on the outside of the sphere, or in this case, along the rim. So what we do now is if we check velocity, you can see that when these spawn, they start pushing out from the center. Now that's really useful for us because what we want to do is have a big explosion where they all shoot out at high velocity. And if I were to go down and set this to be 20, you can see they pop out like this. Now it's time that we set this up so that they are all exploding in a big bunch rather than just spraying out like this. And to do that, what we need to do is go to our spawn and we're going to set the rate to 0. And instead we're going to go down to burst list, and we're essentially going to create a big burst of particles that shoots out at one time. So I'm going to go to this and I'm going to set it to 500. And you can now see that they all spawn at the same time, and it spawns 500 that shoot out all around. So with these popping out, what we're going to do is we're going to vary the speed of each particle so that they're not all just moving at a speed of 20. Instead, I'm going to go to my sphere, I'm going to go to distribution, and I'm going to change it from a constant distribution, which means a single number, to a uniform distribution, which means pick a value between two given numbers. And in this case, I'm going to set the two numbers to be 20 and 30. and you can now see that we get this wider ring of particles shooting out. Now, if I go up, you can see that we have a constant radius of 50, and I want to set this radius to be about 200 instead, because I know that the particle wave is going to have to generate around this, and I know that these are reasonably wide. So I think around 200 is probably going to be a better starting number. And this is something you can adjust to kind of configure to however you want it to look. For instance, I could do between 20 and 10 to kind of get this happening. It's really up to you. But what we need to do from here is make these not look like little crosses and instead sparks. So how do we do that? Well, we create a material for the particle system. Now to do this, what I need to do is, actually I'm going to put my content browser up here. I'm going to right click and I'm going to make a material that's going to be called m_simple spot. Now this is one of my favorite types of materials to create because it's something I use in many particle effects. And that is that instead of generating a round, perfectly circular particle with a texture, I generate it programmatically. And by generating it programmatically, what it lets me do is have a much nicer edge whenever we zoom in on the particles themselves. So right click and type in radial. And you'll see we have radial gradient exponential. So click on that, and what this generates for us, I'm just going to plug this in for a moment so you can see it, is a nice simple radial circle. So we've got this going. What do we do from here? Well, we go and we set the material to not be opaque. Instead, we want it to be translucent. And we don't want this to be the color, we want this to represent the opacity. Now at the moment, because emissive color is set to black, this is popping out like this. I should point out at this point that there are situations where you may want this to be additive instead of translucent, but for what I'm doing, I'm going to set this to translucent for the time being, just to keep it a little more straightforward. I'm going to go shading model and set it to unlit, because we don't really care about any lighting data. And I'm also going to go and set this emissive color by right-clicking, typing in the word particle, and you'll see that if we go to the very top, we have particle color as an option. So what this lets me do is any particle color that's given within the particle system will output this node. The alpha value is currently not tied to anything. So if I get this and I multiply the alpha against the radial exponential, this actually lets me set it up so that this fades out, which is exactly what we want. So I've added a multiply, which plugs into the opacity channel. I've added my particle color, plugged into emissive color. I'm now going to save this particle system material, and I'm going to go back to my bumper sparks. And it's at this point that if you go to required, you can set this from default particle to be simple spot. Now initially when these load in, they're just going to be white circles, and that's okay, that's a good start. In fact, I'm going to use that to get my color system set up. So at the moment, the color over life, if I click on this, I can view the points that they're currently adopting. So what this means is that at the moment, at 0 seconds of their life, so the very start of their life, these are white. And at the end of their life, they're still white. So if we wanted to, we could adjust this curve here, and we could have them fade from a color back to being white. So if I was to change this number from 1 to say 50, and this to say, there we go, that looks quite nice. So 50, 10, 0.1 were the values I just put in there. Now if I go down to alpha over life, you can see that these are also, over the duration of their life, going between the value of 0, so at 0% of their life, they are at 1 for their alpha. And at 1, meaning 100% of their life, they're at 0 alpha. So these are set to fade out. However, every particle currently lives for as long as the next. So I'm going to change this from 1 to be 0.1 and 3. So the lifetime is now going to have these particles kind of fading out over time. 0.1 might be a little early, so I might change this to say 0.5. And that gets us something that's a bit more like that. Now the next thing is that these particles that are shooting out are unfortunately, well, if you look at them, they're perfectly circular. But sparks really kind of adopt the velocity of the particle that's being shot out of them. So how do we fix that? I'll show you. We go to required, and see we have this section called PSA square. This means that every particle is essentially a square that is pointed right at you. But if we want to, we can click on this and say, you know what, make that square face along the direction that it's currently traveling in, which is what PSA velocity is. So if I set that, and I go to my initial size, I want you to see what happens when I change the x values to be 2 and say 10. So the y values are both set to 25 and the x is randomly between 2 and 10. You'll see that the particle systems are a lot thinner because they're being stretched along the y-axis by comparison. And this lets us do some pretty cool stuff. For instance, if instead of going between 2 and 10, let's set this to be 10, 50, and 20 and 30. We now get these particles that are these nice long particles. I might actually crank that up a little bit further. There we go. So I'm going to save this system, and I'm just going to drop it into the world for the time being so we can see what it looks like. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to get bumper sparks, and I'm just going to drop it into the world. Now, this represents one of the first issues that you can really get when you're working with Unreal and particles. At the moment, we're using what's called temporal anti-aliasing, which is a really, really nice anti-aliasing solution, but it does have the issue that it can end up anti-aliasing out your effects because they're so small. So how do we fix this? We go back to our material, and I go to this section here, and I'm going to type into here responsive, and you'll see that we have responsive AA, and I'm going to turn that on. This essentially tells it to not use any anti-aliasing on the particle effects, and you're going to be careful where you do this. You really don't want to abuse it. But you'll notice that these are now much more vibrant when they're popping in, which is good for us. But it also means that when we look at this, we can see how we want this to be attached to the object, and like how big it should be. So if I was to put this here, these particles would currently shoot out at about that radius, which might be a little too big. So I'm going to go back to my bumper, and I'm going to drop the sphere size down to, say, about that, which is looking a little bit nicer. However, I will increase the speed. So I'm going to go sphere between 20 and 30. That's much nicer. So those are now projecting out and looking reasonably good. However, there's one other thing that I want to do. If I go to this and I right click up here, I can go type data. Now at the moment these are all being calculated on the CPU, but if we want to, we can actually push them over to the GPU, which means that they're way less intensive. So if I right click, I can hit GPU sprites. You've got to remember if you're doing GPU sprites is to change this to have a bounding box. You can see that there's a warning popping up at the moment. Now a nice simple way of doing the bounding box is letting the particle system play out, and at any stage clicking up here and click set fixed bounds, which is going to find where the furthest away particles are right now and set those as being the maximum size of the particle system for you to catch when you're viewing it. So I clicked there and I just clicked set fixed bounds. Now the thing with GPU particles is that it actually lets us, if we want to, turn this number up without really having anywhere near as many issues with performance, which can create some really cool effects. But be careful not to overdo it. So for the time being, I'm going to set it to that, and I'm also going to right click and I'm going to go down to collision. And this is another cool thing that we can do. Under collision, we can just set it up so that when these particles hit something, they bounce. So if I view this in the world again, I'm just going to have to drag it back in because I deleted it. If I view this in the world, you can see that when this particle system goes off, those particles would kind of explode out and bounce off of things and create some chaos, which is kind of cool. But it is up to you as to how much chaos you really want to create, so fine-tune this number to be whatever you want it to be. I'm going to set it to be about half of what it is right now, just as a test, and go from there. I'm also going to set my lifetime to be between 0.5 and 2, because that seems like it would have been better, judging by what we just saw. So, the next thing that we're going to do is quickly implement it into our bumper. So I'm going to right-click here, I'm going to edit the bumper, and what I'm going to do here, in the event that is bump, after we add the score, I'm going to right-click, I'm going to type in the word particle, and I'm just going to spawn an emitter at the location. I'm going to click here and select bumper sparks, and I'm going to say the location that we want is the bumper mechanism's world location. And then if I plug this in and this in, we should now be set. Oh, there is one other thing, and you'll see the issue when we're playing, but it's good that you know what the consequences of not setting it up. Now, If you had been paying attention then, you'd have noticed that the systems were playing again and again and again over and over. So to fix that, what we need to do is in the particle system, we need to tell it to only play one time. So under required, you'll see that we have under duration emitter loops. I'm just going to set that to 1, which means only play one time and then it's completed. Now the other thing that I had was that they were spawning too close to the center of the bumper, and they were being culled out on the sides. So I am, after all, going to go back to here and set this to be a larger size. 150, maybe 200. I'm not sure yet, but let's have a quick look. And that's all you need to do. So go through, develop any particle systems that you want. There's some pretty cool stuff you could do. For instance, if you wanted to, you could add gravity, so I could go acceleration and tell these to start falling down and bounce off the ground. You know, there's some really cool stuff you can do. So have a look around, figure out where you want to spawn particles, and set some things up. You know, when the player's ball goes out, maybe you should explode the ball instead of just teleporting it. When this is a multiplier, let's have some celebratory effects going on there. So that's it for the pinball project. From this point on, I'll show you a couple of examples of different setups that we've had, but we'll be moving on to the next project, which will be a little bit cooler. It'll be featuring an outdoor environment and a little more action. We're going to be developing a top-down survival game now, and this is going to require some outdoor landscapes, which means we're going to need some additional assets. So launch the current build of the engine. And from here, I want you to create a new project. Now, in this instance, I'm going to be creating the project from a blank template. So once the editor is launched up, I want you to go to New Project and just select blank. And I'm going to be calling this Survival. Again, blank. And this time around, I'm not going to bother with any of the starter content. So I'm just going to click No Starter Content because I believe there will be enough from the assets we'll be importing. So create project, and this will create a new project for us. Now, while this is going, I'm going to go about locating the assets that we're going to be building upon. So in your launcher, go to your Marketplace tab and go up to the top and do a search for Infinity Blade. That launched over the top, so Infinity Blade, and just press enter. And this will do a quick search, and you'll see that we have a bunch of assets that have been developed by Epic, and these are all free. Now in this situation, the assets that we actually want to be building upon are these Infinity Blade Grasslands assets. So click on that, and then add it to the survival project that you've just created. So just go to here, and click Add to Project, and in this situation, I'm going to do a search for Survival, and the project I'm going to add it to is this newly created Survival project. Add to Project. And now we wait. Now once this is completed, we'll have all of these assets that are in this set in our own game. And this is fantastic for quite a few reasons. Essentially this content was developed for a mobile release, which means that it's all been pretty well optimized and we can use quite a lot of it no matter which platform we choose to deploy to. Since we're doing a game that's going to be top-down survival, it means that we don't really have to care all that much about what things look like when they're super up close, which is really, really useful for us. Now in this situation, this is now finished adding to the project, so I'm going to open up this, and if I were to go to my content browser, I'd now see that we have, I'm just going to click on this button here to open the sources panel, I can now see that we have Infinity Blade Grasslands as a pack that's been added. And if I double click on this, you can see that you have effects, environments, and maps. Now I could open the overview map and see what's there. It's, in my opinion, a better idea to start with how it's being used and then look at the number of pieces they used to create it. So I'm going to open up this Elfin Ruins map for a quick overview and how this content is set up. So here we are, it's loaded up. I'm now going to click on the tab to open the map, and I'll see that I have this around. So hit G to go into game modes to get rid of all of the volumes and such. We can see that we have quite a bit of content here that we can use as a foundation for what it is we're developing. Essentially, I want to have a very similar environment to this that we look down upon from this kind of angle. We can click to send our player in different locations, and we can throw magic and swipe our sword as well. So in this situation, we're going to be developing off of all of these assets, and while this does look like a lot, it's a good idea to go to the overview map that's included with this package. So in the overview map, you'll see that while it seemed like we had a lot of content, there's this amount there. And don't get me wrong, this is all free, so I'm certainly not complaining, but it's great to know what you can do with limited pieces. And we're going to be extending on this with a couple of additions. Now that means it's time for us to start looking at the first stage of all of this, which is to create a landscape using the textures that are included in this pack as a way of having an environment that we can simply paint into. So, move on to the next presentation and check out how the landscapes go together. So in beginning creating our landscape, we're going to go to File, New Level, and I want you to go ahead and just create a default level. Now we're going to be creating a default level so that we've got some basic lighting and fog conditions already in there, but I want you to delete this static mesh that we have in the middle. Now for this session we're going to be creating a basic landscape, and this is going to take some time. So initially this is going to go through the creating of the landscape and how to use tools with it. And it's going to be followed by how to develop more complex materials to use with landscapes. And I've got to be, really stressing this point that properly designed materials are what take your landscapes from being like a 3 or a 4 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10. Like they're really the final step that makes it, and a lot of people overlook them. So it's incredibly important that you understand how to set them up. Now in this situation, we're just going to be stepping through the basics of landscapes to begin with. But I want you to go to your landscape under your modes panel, and if I right click and zoom out, I can now see that this is what I have here. Now it's going to look a little bit daunting at first, but I want to go through what we have. We have components, we have sections, and then we have quads. Now a component is made out of sections, and a section is made out of quads. The amount that your landscape tessellates, so as you move around, the amount of extra detail that it works into its three-dimensional space, is dictated by the number of quads, which is determined by the number of sections. Now, components are what we use for these larger sections, and if none of a component is visible, the entire section won't be drawn. So you've really got to think about how you optimize these, because if you have a lot of components, then if I'm really close to the ground, as I look away, it's more likely to cull them out. For instance, if I was here, it wouldn't draw all of the information that was on this side of the screen. The second I look around, it would. If you look at a piece like this, even though I can only see the corner, it's still going to be rendering the 3D information off screen. But the second I can't see the component, we're good. Now, the problem is that if I was to zoom out, this would actually have more overhead because each of the components render separately, which means we're going to be adding more overhead if we're looking at a lot of the landscape at once. However, if we're going to be looking at it in small sections, you want to have more components. So it's a bit of a trade-off, and you need to understand this before you go into developing. And to be honest, it's one of those things that you're probably going to do a couple of times before you really get it right. Now in this example, I could be setting this up to have 63 by 63 quads and then the number of sections as 2 by 2. But then if I wanted to, I could set the number of components to be 4 by 4. And you can see the divisor between the sections and the components because you can see the different color of the lines. So this is the same size as before, however we have fewer overall components. Now for the time being, I'm just going to leave it on this because this is as good a place to start for the type of situation that we're going to be setting up. It's a reasonably small landscape, and because we're kind of looking down, I'm not too concerned about the overall loading. It should be okay. But I've created this, and now I'm going to reach over here and see that we have this button that says Create. Pressing this is what switches it into an actual object. At the moment it's just like a potential landscape. Now it's worth noting that if all of these numbers confuse you, you can look at Epic's website and go through and view the documentation for the best suggestions of sizes and component ratios to kind of, get the most efficient use of space. So definitely check that out if you feel like you're in deep water here and you're not sure how to proceed. But for the meantime, just follow my lead and press Create. So upon pressing Create, it's going to create the actual landscape itself. Now don't be concerned about these black lines. These black lines are the result of us not having built lighting yet. If I was to view this in unlit mode, you can see that there are no black lines. They're purely temporary until we have lighting in place. Now, I actually don't want to go any further without doing that, so I'm just quickly going to go back into place mode. I'm going to type in light mass, And I'm going to add a light mass importance volume. I'm going to set its location to be 0, 0, 0. And now I'm just going to scale this up to be the size of the landscape. So I'm going to set this to be 60,000 by 60,000. And in terms of height, I'm going to set this for the time being to be 5,000 is probably not good enough. Let's go 10,000 just in case. And we might even turn this up a little bit more. And normally I would hit build, but it's going to take a little time for me to do so. So if you would like to, you can hit build and then continue on. It'll just get rid of these lines. But in the meantime, I've done this for future use, and I'm going to go to my landscape, and let's start looking at the sculpting tools. Now, to begin with, your sculpting tools, if you've ever used Photoshop, they essentially use most of the same hotkeys as Photoshop. So keep that in mind, as it makes life way easier. In this case, we have Sculpt, Circle, and Smooth are all set up as our tool is the Sculpt tool. Circle refers to the type of brush we have, and Smooth refers to the kind of fall off. So if I were to look at my landscape, I could test this tool out by holding down left click to just paint straight onto the landscape. And you can see that this is a great way for me to start setting up some external hills around my map. Now if I was to hold down Shift left click, you can now see that it does the opposite, and I'm now carving holes into my map. So this is very, very useful because I can just carve out an entire arena and have everything looking great in no time. I can also use the square brackets on my keyboard, or I could use this to change the brush size. And this is great because I can set the size to be substantially larger to quickly paint more of the environment. Just be careful about going too large, because if you do so really quickly, it can kind of get out of hand without you realizing it. Sometimes you have more fun than you really should be for these kinds of things. So I'm going to paint this into the environment and just have a general setup, but let's start looking at some other tools that I could use to accompany this. In this situation, I'm going to go back to the Sculpt tool and I'm going to try something else. Let's have a look at the Flatten tool. So when I use the Flatten tool, if I was to click here and drag across, wherever I clicked on initially, it's going to flatten the environment out to be at the same height as that. So I can use this to easily carve out sections, and it'll raise them up or lower them down, whichever is required. But I can use this to create easy plateaus or pathways, and that's fantastic. The other thing that I can do with this that I think is very important to note is that when I click here, you can see that it's flattening, but it has this kind of ramping off around where this fall off area is. So the outermost circle. If I was to click that, it doesn't just flatten that section down. However, if I was to go to here and set the brush fall off to 0, I would remove all of it. And if I looked at this, you'd now see that we have an incredibly sheer wall where that drops off. By the same token, if I went the other direction and had the fall off set to 1, it's now going to be smoothly kind of going in. This is more prevalent in other tools than just the Flatten tool. You can use it in all sorts of areas, but it is worth keeping in mind. So now that we've looked at the Flatten tool, let's cover the Ramp tool. This is one of those things that somehow no one seems to know exists, but it's kind of amazing. If I get the Ramp tool and I click here, and then I click up here, it'll draw out a ramp in space. Why is that great? Well, if I click Add Ramp, it'll automatically add in a flattened landscape between position A all the way up to position B. And I'm sure you can see why that would be useful in a lot of situations when you're crafting out an environment. Now, if I click, it's always going to go from where that base point was. However, if I want to, I can click Reset to clear the first point. So this is very, very useful. And while it is called Ramp, keep in mind that if I was to go to my Sculpt tool and I was to paint something from here and something to here, while it is called Ramp, there's no reason that I couldn't have a reasonably flat road going from A to B and add it that way. And again, there's the amount of fall off that you add. So if I undid the previous addition and I got the fall off and did it this way, you can now see that with basically no fall off, it's an incredibly smooth line straight up and straight down. However, if I went the other way and set it to 0, we would have shear walls on either side. So very useful Ramp tool. No one seems to know about it, but now you do. So next up, we're going to look at some of the other tools that are quite useful. There's a time to use them and a time not to, and it's one of those things that you're really going to get a feel for as you work with them. Essentially, they simulate erosion, so they simulate what would happen over time to an environment. And if I just paint this in there, you can see that it's painting in these little changes, just this little bit of noise that's determined by where the current ramps are and everything else. If I go to something like this, which has a strong profile, and I erode it, you can see that it immediately starts smoothing out the sides, creating little lines of noise around them. And it's a good way to get something that looks a little more natural. However, it's very easy to carve into the world. That said, we can kind of mitigate that a bit by looking at how it's set up. If I get the noise, at the moment it's set to lower, but if I wanted to, I could set this to only raise. So it'll do the erosion, but it'll only do the erosion that lifts it up. It'll ignore anything that's lowering the environment. Alternatively, I could go to both, and I could paint in so that it both drops sections and raises sections. This is really going to depend on the kind of environment that you're after and how you want it to look, but it is a very useful tool for getting a much more natural look to your mountains and hills. Now the next thing that I'm going to go to is hydro erosion. Now this simulates what would happen if rain was to fall in these areas, and it works in a very similar way to the standard erosion, in that I can just kind of paint this in, and it's going to carve out around these dips. It's a bit hard to see right now. I'm just going to quickly go to my world outliner, which is over here, and I'm just going to set my light source to be movable for the time being, which will get rid of all of those lines and put it into a dynamic lighting environment. But you can see that by using the hydro erosion, it's created far more substantial dips. But again, I can change this to be either dipping and raising or just raising. There's no purely negative one for this one. So if I set this, we can have some other effects that can kind of kick in there. But I do recommend checking out the hydro erosion tool. I use it in moderation. So instead of holding it down like I was there, I find kind of like clicking a little bit and letting go and letting it kind of carve out that nice groove, and then moving on with regular erosion works reasonably nicely. If I go towards the bottom of any hill, it's always going to start creating these kind of effects over time. And you can change things like the amount of rain that it's simulating pouring onto the landscape and turn it down a bit, which can create a far, less aggressive effect. It's all up to you. Next up, we're going to be looking at some of the other tools. We're going to be focusing on how to copy and paste and how to mirror, as well as how to select regions. But we'll be doing them in the next tutorial. So the retopologize tool is incredibly useful, but it is one of those things that you aren't going to use that often. So while it is very useful, often you forget that it even exists, and therefore it just kind of slides by. Now it essentially works by remapping the UVs such that when I paint it on, it kind of handles the projection in a slightly nicer way. So it's really, really useful when you have really strong cliffs. You can go through and make sure that the texture correctly kind of adheres to them. So I'm going through here and I can just retopologize it so it does a nicer job of kind of splicing inverts onto it. But be aware that doing so adds overhead, and it's something that you probably therefore don't really want to do. So unless you have a strong cliff that is just quite messed up as far as the textures are concerned, I would typically stay away from it, but remember that it is there if you want it. Now if we go beyond the retopologize tool, we have the visibility tool, which I can't use right now because we haven't set up any visibility culling. So I'm going to skip past that, and instead I'm going to show you these region tools. So let's begin with the mirror tool. Now the mirror tool, the second you click on it, is going to give you this. And the reason that the mirror tool is fantastic is that you can set up where the mirror is in the map, and you can set up how you want it to actually work, like which axes and everything else. But what that means is that if I go to sculpt and I've got the mirror tool, I can now hit apply, and you'll see that we've just created a map that, if I was making a capture the flag map, for instance, would be perfectly mirrored. So see, the environment has just been flipped. So in this case, it's copying -x to +x. If I wanted to, though, I could copy this side over to here, and it would end up like that. Alternatively, if we wanted to, we could do some kind of interesting stuff. So you can do rotate -x to x, which gives you this. So that has been kind of rotated around to here instead of just mirrored. And these are all, fantastic for different kinds. And again, I can do this on the y-axis too. So I could drop this over here. But these are the kind of things that are very useful if you're doing team-based games and you need to ensure that both sides of your landscape are going to match. Now, apart from the mirror tool, there's a really, really useful copy-paste functionality kind of built in. If I get my copy-paste tool and I was to start selecting a region, what I'm able to actually do is grab something and then move it to anywhere else that I want to. Now to do this, you need to first use your selection tool. So I'm going to just use this to quickly paint in a selection. If I now hit Control C, you can see that it's done a selection and copied this area that I've just selected. It's automatically, upon hitting Control C, returned me to the copy paste tool. And if I want to, I can now actually copy the data to the gizmo. It is done. I now want to fit the gizmo to values in a selected region. So if I get this and I put this over here, I can now hit paste. So either Control V or I can click it over there. But you can see that it's now given me that as a tool. So if I hit Control Z, and I'm going to go back into editor mode, I had gameplay enabled. You can see that upon hitting Control C, it's done this. So I'll go through that one more time so you can see. I go to selection. I'm going to I'm going to select what it is. I'm just going to quickly do a shift select because I don't actually want any of that stuff there. Let's say that we wanted to copy this little mountainy hill here. We wanted to put another one of these elsewhere on the map. Control C automatically loads up the gizmo, at which point I can literally just grab it and drag it to wherever I want. So you can see that now that I've copied this in, if I wanted to, I can do some pretty cool stuff. Instead of going paste mode and setting this to both, if I hit raise, this will now only raise it up above the polys that are currently there. So in this case, it created a tiny bump unless I grab this and pull it up and then hit paste, at which point it would give me this. Again, the same thing could be done to lower. So if I wanted to, I could get this and drop it to here, hit paste, and it's only going to drop in the dips. It won't add any of the raised height. This is going to be more obvious if I was to get this and move this over to here, which is a flatter, expansive land. I've got this, I'm going to pull it down to about there. Now you can see that there's meant to be a hill, but upon pasting it, there's no hill, there's only the dips that were around the hill. So again, really useful. If you create a cool mountain that you feel like you could rotate in 12 different ways, it's a great way to start. Now, with the copy and paste tool covered, it's time for us to start looking at some of the other tools that we have. And that means that we've actually got to go into the paint section and start looking at how we can set up materials that actually work for us. So we don't want to just focus on the simple painting tools, we really want to get into the more interesting and complicated stuff. That said, we're going to start with the most basic environment that we can, and we'll work up from there. So the next lesson is going to be an introduction to landscape painting. So it's time for us to look at painting landscapes. Now this is a really interesting feature that they've added in that they have both weighted and non-weighted painting. Now I'm going to show you how these work. First off, I'm going to bring my content browser back down this way, and I'm going to, in content, I'm going to create a new folder that's going to be called landscape assets. I'm just isolating these a bit to make my life a little bit easier when I want to handle everything. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to add a material, and this is going to be called m_simple landscape. Now we're not going to be running with this in the end, however we will be using this for quick testing to begin with. Before I go any further as well though, I do want to clear the region selection that was there because that was just driving me nuts. So click on that button up top and you'll be good. At which point what I'm going to do is double click on simple landscape, and I want you to just add two things for me. First, what we're going to do is I want to right click and type in landscape, and you'll see that we have a couple of landscape specific options. Now in this case, the one that I want to add is going to be a landscape layer blend. And I want you to add and call it grass, and add another and call it dirt. Now this isn't going to be our final product, so I don't care about how intense the setup is. It's purely there for the sake of demonstrating things. Now if I get grass and I add a vector, so I'm going to hold down V and left click, and then I'm going to set this color to be something vaguely green for demonstration. and I plug this in, I'm now going to add another one. So I hit Control W, I'm going to call this dirt, and I'm going to click here and set this to something vaguely brownish and plug that in. Now you can preview how this would look if my preview weight was set to 1. You can see that it would be green. Now I'm going to hit apply and save. Now the reason I bring this up as a very important feature as the difference between landscape types is that when I go back to here and I go to my landscape, I'm going to go to over here, I'm going to set the material for the landscape. Okay, so I'm going to set this up to be using the material that we've just created. Now by default, this is going to be selecting the landscape gizmo. Honestly, I find it easier sometimes to just ignore the management setup for a little bit and just click on the landscape up top. But you can see that once I did click it, we've got all of our options available. And I'm going to set this to be simple landscape. Now, upon doing so, you'll see that the two layers that we created, grass and dirt, are both exposed. And what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to add some layer info for both of them. So to do that, all you need to do is click on Create Layer Info, and for the time being, we're going to add Weight Blended Layer, because that's what I wanted to demonstrate to everyone. I'm going to put this in Landscape Assets, and I'm going to do this again, Weight Blended, and put it in Landscape Assets. So we've got these two things set up. Now, if you right-click on Grass and click Fill Layer, and then wait a second, you'll see that it's now covered the landscape in green. And if I wanted to, I could click on Dirt, and I could paint in. First time you ever add anything to a component, by the way, it's going to do what you just saw. It's going to have to rebuild the material if that combination's never been used. And I'm going to paint this straight in. Now this looks fine and dandy, right? But what you'll notice is happening is that when I paint in dirt, it removes the grass. So eventually it fades from green to brown and is then exclusively brown. Now the difference between weighted landscape layers and non-weighted is that if you use non-weighted layers, you can actually paint onto each layer if you set up a way for them to blend, which we do with height maps. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if we had, for instance, a rock layer and a grass layer, as the grass layer blended into the rock layer, we could fill in the cracks on the rock and add grass in between the cracks on the rock until it became all rock. Or we could keep it as a mix between both. And that's where the real power comes from, in my opinion, of the advanced landscape systems that you can set up. So let's go about doing that. So for this next presentation, we're going to be focusing on advanced landscapes. We're moving on to advanced landscapes now, but this is going to take us some time because we're going to need to create two material layers first and then the landscape material. We're going to try and do this in conjunction with having an actual landscape, but it is still going to have a little bit of crossover between making the layers and making the landscape material. So let's begin. I'm actually going to get this and nuke everything that I've done. So I'm going to go File, New, and I'm going to use a default map again. I'm just going to delete this and go back to adding a landscape, and once again I'm going to have the settings that I had before with 2x2 and 4x4 for the components. So add that and create. I'm also once again going to set my light source to mobile just for the sake of not having the lines on screen, and just very quickly I'm going to paint in a bit of some hills, purely so I can actually have something to really look at and understand how it's all set up, so that as I'm doing my landscape I can see how it looks on the assets itself. So just very quickly, I'm just going to add some sculpting in. Now that'll do for the time being, and let's have one larger mountainy area over here that's in the distance. Oh, too much. Cool, that'll do. I don't mind too much. So I've got some flat areas to check it, some noisy areas to check it, and a big area to check it. Now, I'm going to delete these landscape layer infos that we had already created. And I'm going to keep simple landscape material just as a memory of all that could have been. And I'm going to go m_landscape _01. So this is going to be my landscape material. Now, how this is going to work is we're going to create a landscape that is going to have two sub-materials within it. So what I mean by that is it's going to have a grass layer and a dirt layer that are going to actually be made up from their own material layers. And I'll show you how this works. If you right click next to all of this and we go to materials, we can create a material function. And I want you to call this ml_grass. So upon double clicking, it's going to look like the material editor, because it essentially is, but there is a big difference. You'll notice that I'm no longer outputting to a standard material. Instead, I'm just outputting to a result. And this is essentially a way for me to create my very own material nodes, which is pretty cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a dirt layer to begin with. So to do this, I'm going to hold down T and I'm going to left click. And this in the texture is going to be set to the dirt texture that came in the Infinity Grasslands pack. So T_dirt. So there you can see we have a basic dirt texture. Next up, I'm going to hold down T, and this time around what I'm going to do is plug it into the normal for the dirt. Now if I wanted to plug in the diffuse and the normal into the result, I couldn't, because right now I don't have the standard color and roughness and normal and all of those inputs that I would usually have. Instead I just have a single thing. But that's okay, because what we can do is we can drag off of this and type in set material, and you'll see that we have set material attributes. Now this looks like it has a single input, but this is where this is quite cool. If I go over to here and add an element, what I'm actually able to do is add pins that create a material. So I'm going to add a base color, I'm going to add a roughness, I'm going to add a normal. So you can now see that we have 3 pins that would act as if they were one large make material attributes node. So if I plug this into base color, you can see now that it's applying it as if it was the base color on a standard material. Next up, I'm going to plug this into normal, and you can now see that we've got that happening too. However, we do have a bit of an issue with our dirt, and that is that we need to be able to set the roughness on it. At the moment there's no value being set, and yeah, I could just plug a number into it, but you know, that's not really where we want to end up on. What I ideally want to have is a roughness that is less, that is more rough around the dirt and a little less rough around where these rocks are, so we can get a little bit more of a shine on them. So how do we do that? Here's how. If I was to get the information coming out of the color data here, and I was to just grab a single channel of it, say the green channel. So if I got this, and I was to then look at it, I'm going to multiply it by a value of 1, which means it'll be just the channel. I'm going to start previewing that node. This is what I can see. You'll see that the rocks are highlighted as a grayer color than the dirt, which is a darker color. Now what we can do here is quite cool. We can get this and we can multiply it by, say, 3, just as an example. And in doing so, the brights got brighter, and yes, the darks did too, but if we use this in conjunction with a clamp and what's called a power node, we can create some very interesting effects from just pulling data out of the color data that's here. What I mean by that is, so at the moment, if a value was equal to 1 on the green channel, it would now be equal to 3, because I've multiplied it by 3. However, if I clamp this, if a value was equal to 3, it's now only equal to 1, because it doesn't let the value go above the max or below the minimum. Now why did I do this? I did this because I'm now going to use what's called a power node, and these are really useful nodes, because what they essentially do is they get the data coming in, and for each pixel they do a power of function on them. And what that means is, if you think about how this works, 1 to the power of 2 is equal to 1. However, 0.5 to the power of 2 is equal to 0.25, which means the lower a number is, when I power it, it's going to actually approach darker, while the lighter values are going to stay within a lighter range. So if I preview this, you can now see that by doing a power of, the rocks have stayed reasonably white. However, the dirt itself has gotten much darker. So this allows us to then create a blend between the dirt and the rocks that sets up the 2 roughness values that we would want to have here. So all I need to do that is add a linear interpolate, which allows us to blend between 2 values using an alpha value. So if I plug this in, At the moment it's blending between 0 and 1, so it's going to be exactly what we just saw. However, if this was to blend so that the dark dirt was equal to a value of 0.95, and the rock, on the other hand, was equal to a value of 0.5, you can see now that the rocks are going to be significantly smoother and the dirt's going to be quite rough. So if I plug this into my roughness value and I go to previewing the output result again, you can now see that we have a much rougher rock surface, but the rocks themselves, a much rougher dirt surface, but the rocks themselves can have a little bit of a shine. And if I go back to this lerp, I can actually change those values around. If I set that to 0, for instance, it's a bit more apparent. You can see that those rocks are they're getting that quite a shine as the light hits them directly. You can see it mostly on this one. But for the time being, I really am thinking that a value of about 0.4 is probably going to be fine. And that's going to be a good base for us to create a dirt material. Now, this is the initial setup that we have for one dirt layer, but there's a bit of a problem that we have, and I'm going to show you what that is. If I was to get this material that we've just created, which I called ML grass and I just realized was meant to be ML dirt, that's okay. Let's just rename this. I'm going to go to ML grass and I'm going to rename this using F2 to ML dirt. If I go into my landscape and I add the dirt layer, so to do that I can go here and then just get the dirt and drag it into it. You can now see that dirt is outputting a result. Now I can't plug this in at the moment. However, if I go to this node within the properties that says use material attributes, this allows me to plug it straight in and create the dirt material plugged into here. Now this is going to have a couple of big issues when we first set it up, and I'll show you what those are. So I've got my advanced landscape. I'm going to drop it onto here. I forgot, sorry, you can't drag and drop. I'm going to click here and I'm going to set the landscape material to be my landscape. Now, this is going to be applied to here. Now, I'm sure you can see the first issue that we've got. The tiling is incredible, but also if I was to stand here, you can see this repeating pattern going all across the landscape. So, how do we fix that? I'll show you that in the next session. So this was creating the basics of material functions, or in this case material layers, but next up we're going to look at how we handle landscape blending and material layer blending over a distance. So here we are, we've added a very basic landscape, but let's set this up so that we can get some significantly nicer effects out of this, and we can get rid of this tiling effect going on. So I'm going to go back to my ML dirt, and this time, instead of having this set up in such a way that we just get this texture coming in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an input. So right click and type in input, and you see that we have function input. Now what I essentially want to do is I want to have it so that, I'm going to hit apply so you can see this. By adding an input, you can see that the input is now a node in the material function itself. So you can name these and set these to any type that you want. In this case, we're going to be plugging in the landscape's UV data into this texture and this texture. So I'm going to set this to be input type vector2, and it's going to be called close UVs. So plug that in and plug that in. Now it's going to look broken right now because at the moment it doesn't know what value it should be. But what we can do is right click, landscape layer coords, and plug that in. And now if I hit apply and I go back, oh, of course. So this value that's been plugged in is currently set up such that it's previewing off of this information, but it's not equal to this information in the final build. And that's because if I go to here, there's a little thing that says use preview value as default. So I'm going to check that because I actually want to do that. Now essentially what I want to have set up here is apply, save it. You can now see that this is gray where before it was white. And the reason for that is if I go back to here, the UV data is being read straight in. But what does that mean? Well, it means in my material, if I was to go to here and set up landscape coords, and let's just plug in a number such as 12. you can now see that it's scaled up the entire landscape. And here's the problem. All the tiling's gone, but if I was at ground level, this would look quite large. But if I pull back to here, you can see that again we have some tiling. So what we actually need to do is something a little bit creative here. We need to essentially set it up so that when we're close to the ground, the area around us is a very tight, compact material layer. But when we pull away and we're further away from an object, the material is going to be a much larger pattern, but we're not going to notice that it's missing detail because we're so far away from it. So how we do that is we go back to our ml_dirt and we look at what we have here. Now, this is our basic material, but what if we change this around a little bit? What if we set this up such that this was the close one, but we had another material that was being blended in to be the far one? So the quickest way for us to do this is going to be select everything that we've got to here, and I'm just going to Control W to duplicate it. Before I go any further, I'm going to go to my input and I'm going to set this to be distant UVs. And I'm going to set up these values as well. Now in this situation, I'm going to set these up to be, my gut feeling says that this could be set up as a scale of 19. And before I set this up to be a scale of 12, I might go a little bit lower with 10. Now it's going to be a little hard to see here, but hopefully you'll be able to see it on the landscape itself. Now, what I've essentially done here is I've created two of the same pipelines, but when I get to here where it says set material attributes, I'm now going to actually get this and we're going to blend them. So I can go to this value called blend material attributes. And what this does is it gets this one and it gets this one, and it's like a lerp, except it takes the entire materials to blend them together. All I need to do from this point is find a way to blend the two things together. So before I go any further, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a texture sample to just kind of demonstrate what's going on here. I'm just going to get a shape, doesn't matter what it is, this will do, and I'm going to plug that into the alpha. And the reason I'm doing that is if I hit apply and look at this in the world, if I get close to the ground, it might be a little hard for you to see, but you can see that it's blending between the two of them here. So see how there's those weird lines sticking out? That's because it's blending between them there. So what we need to do is find a way to create a mask around us that is relative to how far we are from the object. And there's a really good way to do this. And to do it, what we need to do is get the world position of the current piece of dirt that we're looking at. Now, once we know where that dirt is, let's find out how far away that dirt is from my camera. And I can do that by typing in the word distance. So absolute world position returns the location in world space of the pixel that we're looking at. And if I get the distance between that and my camera position, oops, accidentally clicked on the wrong one. You can see that we have camera position in world space. If I get that and plug it in, this is actually going to give me a distance value of how far away it is, which means if it's 1,000 Unreal units away, this is going to be a value of 1,000. Now, that's a big number because it means that the only stuff that would ever be in the black part of the mask would be literally touching my face. But if we get this distance and we divide it by a number, so I'm just going to divide this by 1,000. If I divide this by 1,000 and then clamp it, it means that it's never going to be a value over 1. So I've got that, and I've got that, and I'm just going to plug this in for the time being to demonstrate what's going on. In fact, what might be a good idea for me to show it off is to quickly add just I'm going to substitute the current colors that we have in there with some bright colors so you can just see the difference. So don't follow this step yourself, just look at what I'm doing. So I'm going to plug this in and plug this in, and when I'm up close it's orange, and as I move further away it's green. Does that make sense? So when I'm up close it's orange, and when I hit 1,000 units it's now green, so it blends between those two. Now the problem we have is that we really don't want it to start blending for a certain distance, and then after that distance we want it to start blending. So how do we do that? Well, let's think. If this is the distance, if something is 10 meters away from me, if I get the distance value and I subtract a value, so I subtract, say, 1,000, it means that between 0 and 1,000, when it's clamped, the value is still going to equal 0, because when it equals negative 100, for instance, it becomes a value of 0. And then if I do the divide after that, it's going to then do the fall off from that point on. So all I actually need to do here is subtract the distance from my camera. So I'm going to subtract, just as a ballpark, I'm going to subtract 2,000. And if you look at this, it's orange, it's orange, it's orange. But then when I get to this distance, it now fades to green. Now, I'm going to go and delete these nodes that I added and plug in the dirt that I created into my base color. Apply and save. And if I look at this in the world, I'm now going to set this to be a much smaller tile than what we have set up at the moment. So just to demonstrate it a bit better, close UVs are going to be set to a very low number, such as 2 or maybe even 3. Let me try 2. Apply. So give it just a second. Now, notice when it's up close, it's this small stuff. And then as I pull back, it's the big stuff. And if I zoom in slowly, you'll see it blend between the two. So it's up to us to kind of work out how far we wanted to spend blending between the two. Now at the moment it's very visible because you're looking for it. But if you imagine all of the hills and everything else in the way, it becomes a lot harder to spot over time. So how I'm going to do this from here is I'm going to go to my dirt layer and I'm just going to set these values up to be a little bit better. I'm going to set this from being an input of 2 to say an input of 5. Apply. And the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set my distance blend to be something that's a bit better than what we've got at the moment. So at the moment it's waiting 2,000 units before it even starts blending. I'm going to drop that back to be a bit closer, say 1,500. And I'm going to set the divide amount so that it's less abrupt. So we've gone from 1,000, I'm going to turn that up to 2,000. That looks a little bit nicer as I pull away and then I get close. This now looks quite detailed near my feet, but at a distance it also has no noticeable tiling. So that's fantastic. Now, the final thing that I'm going to do in preparation for the next section is going to be setting this up so that this is only really being calculated once. So all I need to do there is create a function input, and this is going to be called distance blend. And all this means is we want to take in a scalar and output that straight to the alpha of the mask, and also check the preview as default. All this means is that while this is in my function right now, if I wanted to, I should hit apply so you can see it. In my landscape material, it's now an input, which means if I wanted to in my main landscape, I could get this and plug it into all of the different layers that I'm going to create so that they all blend together, and I only ever need to change the values at this point. So we've made it something that we can use to preview within the dirt, but we can't override elsewhere. Actually, I'm going to keep this in here for the time being. So with that said, the only other thing that I think is a really good idea right now is for us to create another output. Now at the moment this is outputting result, so let's rename this to be material blended. And I'm going to click on the output and hit Control W. And this one here is going to be called height. Okay? And the reason it's called height is we actually want to calculate what a height mask would look like between these two materials. And the nicest way for me to really do that is to get material attribute, which opens this up and gets a specific value that I want. In this case, the value that I want is going to be just the base color. And once again, I'm now going to do what I did before. I'm going to get a component mask, and I know the green layer works reasonably well for this, so I'm going to follow the same process that I did to create a roughness map. But this time around, what I'm going to create is a height map that kind of helps us out there. In fact, these values are basically what I want up until the very end. So I'm going to get this, and I'm going to then change the power nodes afterwards. So plug that into base color. Whoops, sorry. Plug that. It's there. Yep, there we go. So for anyone that missed it, I'm multiplying, I'm clamping, and I'm powering all over again. This time I'm not going to use the lerp that I had at the end there. So this is my current height map. I'm actually going to increase the power a little bit here so that the dirt is... actually, you know what? No, I'm going to drop this down to about 1.1 looks like it'll probably be good. This way dirt kind of starts filling in those cracks reasonably early before the stones really do. It's up to us how we want this to work, and it's going to take some tinkering after the fact. But for the time being, I think this number is probably going to be okay. Somewhere around 1.1 or 1.25 is probably going to be good. So I'm going to plug that in, and this is going to be height. And this isn't going to be used just yet, but I promise you we'll use it in just a bit. So now that we've seen how to do distance blending on materials, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at how to blend those materials into an advanced landscape. So we've created a dirt material. What I'm going to do now is quickly duplicate this, and this one will be actual ML grass. And I'm going to double click on that. So we've created this. I'm next going to quickly set these textures over to the grass textures that I want to use. So the grass textures are T_grass. So do a search. T_grass 2. These are all coming up because they're in the grass folder. That was nice of it. T_grass 2D. And I'm going to do that for the normal as well. N. And because I'm lazy, no, let's do it this way. So grass 2, so that's the normal, and finally grass 2 diffuse. So we've now got diffuse and normal. Now for something like this, it's going to be easier for me to initially just disconnect the UVs so I can see the material up close as I'm working out the values for everything. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to blend in the same way that I had before. So as we pull away, it's going to be a different grass. But I'm going to have one other thing happening, which is I'm going to make sure that we've got a little bit of what's called fuzzy shading going on. And now fuzzy shading it's a function that kind of it's built to give a bit more of a realistic sheen to glass. To grass at certain angles. So we're going to do that after I've done the blend. I'm then just going to get the diffuse and kind of warp them and then set them back into the material attribute that we already had. This will make sense in just a moment. But essentially what I need to do first is make sure that my height map that's being based off of everything. So I'm going to go to here, start previewing. That looks like it could be alright, but I'm going to increase my multiply to be a value of 5 so that the grass is quite high. And my contrast at the moment is set to 1.5. If I set it to 1, it's that. 2, it's that. So, you know what? Actually, maybe 1.3 or so. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So we've now got our height set up. Our multiply is set to 5. Our power is set to 1.3. And I'm just going to check the roughness value that's being output from here as well. So the roughness values that we have here are, I'm going to preview it before the lerp so I can see what the mask looks like. That does seem like a pretty good split between the grass and the dirt. However, once again, I'm going to increase this multiply value by 5. Make sure you do it on both of these. So we've now got that being set up as a value of 5, which kind of grabs the top of the grass a little nicer. I could even go a little bit higher, to be honest. Say 8. Oh, too high. Yeah, 7 is good as well. So if I get that, and I set this to values of 7, I'm now going to tell the grass that the top, I want you to be a value of 1, and then otherwise I want you to go all the way down to say this dirt area could be 0.4 will probably look alright. If I look at this in here, I'll be able to see it. I think that's okay. It'll be a lot clearer as we go onward. So at the moment I have 1 and 0.4. I'm just going to make sure I set that up on this lerp as well. fantastic. So the last little thing that I need to do to get the grass correctly working is add the fuzzy shading that I mentioned before. So I'm going to right click and type fuzz, and you'll see that we have fuzzy shading grass. Now essentially what I'm going to do for the fuzzy shading for the grass is get the current diffuse color and then run a very simple, run this node on it, which itself is, if I open it up, a large network that's been built to kind of simulate a nice fuzzy area around grass. But all I need to do here is I need to, so we've got the blend material attributes going on right there. I need to get the current diffuse and I need to get the current normal and plug those straight into here. So all I need to do here is we've already got this node sitting here that's getting the material attributes. So I'm going to go to that and I'm going to add normal to that. So diffuse plugs into base color, normal plugs into that. I'm going to right click on this so I can start to see the outcome. So this is going to be the color of the grass. You can see that around the edges the grass is now a bit lighter, which is quite nice. So by default the values, I mean, they're pretty good, but I've got a couple in my head that I know work reasonably well, so I'm actually just going to throw them in. Essentially this controls how much the edge has been desaturated, so how much color it loses. This then gets the color that's being added back into it. Core darkness means that when you're looking straight at the grass, does it get darker or not? And then you've got the overall edge brightness, which is a final value that gets added against them. Now, these can really go in different directions. I'm going to quickly just set some numbers in by holding down 1 and left clicking, left clicking, left clicking, left clicking. So I'm just holding down the number 1. And I'm just going to plug in some values that I know work reasonably well. Keep in mind you can always hover above to see what the default values are. In this case I'm going to set this to be 0.6 edge desats. Oops. I'm going to set the edge color on the other hand to be 2.5 across the board. I'm then going to set the core darkness and finally the edge brightness, which by default is equal to 0.8. I'm going to set to 0.9. So that should look a little nicer. And finally, the last thing that I'm going to do here is we've done the blend, but what I actually want to do is get a set material attributes node that takes the existing material attributes node, and I'm just going to delete the current elements and just add one in that just says base color. So this will swap out the existing base color with the one that we've just created, and that'll blend in instead. And now if I preview this, you can now see that the grass has that little bit of a shine around the edges, which should look a bit more realistic. So I'm going to apply and save. And now it's time for us to look at the landscape and how to blend them. So if I go to my landscape material, you can see that we're currently running dirt straight into landscape. But let's do what we did before, and that is right click, landscape, and go down to landscape blend. Oh, before I forget, I'm going to go back to the very start here and reconnect these UVs for the grass. Easy thing to miss. Apply, save. So the layer blend is going to have two things right now. We have dirt and we have grass. Now the thing that we're going to change, you see where it says blend type weight blend? Switch that over to be height blend. Height blend. And you'll notice that we now have the layer grass, layer dirt, height dirt. So just plug everything in as it should be. So layer dirt plugs into material blended, height plugs into height, and this connects to here. I'm then going to add the grass node that we've created and just drag this into my landscape. So height is going to connect to height, layer to layer. And it's going to be black right now because we haven't given it a blend value. But if I were to set the dirt to be 1, you'll see that we now have fully painted dirt. But if I were to set the grass to 0.5, you can see it's starting to come in. If I then turn the grass blend all the way up to 1, it's going to be a little clearer. So I'll just show you that in just a second. It's hard to see on this node, but if I hit save, and I go back to the landscape, I'm now going to have to quickly reset my landscape up, but that's okay. I just go to landscape, I go to paint. Now at the moment it's kind of just working out what's going on because I just dropped the material that we had on before. A nice way to kind of get it to quickly detect it if it hasn't already is to set it to a different thing and then plug it back in again, and you'll see that the target layers are now appearing. Now by default I actually want to cover this entire environment in dirt. So I'm going to add, and this time it's going to be a non-weight blended layer, which will go into my landscape assets folder. Again, non-weight blended layer, landscape assets. I'm now going to right click on the dirt and I'm going to say fill layer, and this will cover my entire landscape in dirt. Just give it a second, and there it is there. Now at the moment I'm clearly missing something because as I move away we're getting this value. So I'll quickly check what's going on there. So at the moment my distance blend is correctly set up on my grass, and on my dirt you can see it definitely taking place there. So the reason this is currently not working is a rather simple mistake. If I go back to my landscape, before when demonstrating something, I accidentally plugged distant UVs instead of distant blend into that section in my landscape. So you can select the distant UVs on this one and just delete them. Hit apply and save. And then I'm just going to go back into my world and wait for it to quickly recalculate everything. And that's all correctly working again. Okay, so we've got that going. This time though I'm going to select grass and I'm going to start painting in the grass. And one thing that's going to be quite important here is when I paint in the grass, I want to make sure I have a reasonably high fall off. So I only want to really paint the inner section as full grass. Now the reason for that is that if I get this and I just paint it in, give it a second to build it for the first time. So I've painted this in, it's now a blending between grass and dirt. But if I get my dirt and I want to, I can actually then paint my dirt out so that in the center I have full grass, but around the edges the grass kind of calmly, cleanly, nicely blends into the cracks of the dirt and through the rest, which I think works quite nicely. So that's how we are going to go about creating this, and we can add as many layers as we want, and I really encourage you to do this for your landscape. It's up to you what you want to create and how you want to do it, but I would strongly recommend, if you're doing this, to consider creating a couple of extra material layers that are going to make up rock, cliff, that kind of stuff. The next thing that we're going to focus on doing though, now that we've kind of got the basics going and we can start really painting in all of this stuff, is now setting up an environment within this that works reasonably well. So I'm not going to go into the cliffside stuff or rocks or anything just yet. I'm going to focus on getting some meshes in and getting an environment up and running that works nicely. So for this section, we're going to be adding tessellation to our landscape. So I want you to go in and we're going to look at the dirt layer that we have going at the moment. Before we do though, I want you to get a good idea of what happens if I bring the camera down to ground level. At the moment, even though this looks kind of interesting, as we get close you can see that it's just a flat surface. For what we're about to do, I need you to open up the dirt layer, so I'm going to go to ML Dirt. And from in here, we're going to start looking at how to add tessellation. Now to do this, what we need to do is actually modify a world of displacement within ML Dirt. Now I'm going to warn you that what we're about to do has a fair bit of overhead. So be aware that if you're going to do it, you need to really actually want to do it. Don't just kind of throw it in there and assume it'll be fine. That said, it is easy to turn off if it is something that is going to be too much overhead for your game and you only discover that in the long run. But just keep it in mind that this is kind of costly as we do it. So initially we have this output material blended that's pushing out to our landscape material, right? And we're also pushing out a height map here, which is a rough idea of like where the rocks are and where the dirt is to control the overall height. Now we can use this and we can leverage off of this to add tessellation to this. And specifically, the section of tessellation that we're going to be working with is world displacement. So to do that, what I need to do is when we have this blend material attributes over here, I'm going to drag off of that and I'm going to add a set material attributes node. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add world displacement. At which point I'm going to plug this into here. Now, when we add world displacement, you need to remember that we don't just add a height to each section. We need to add a height and a direction. So to do that, what we need to do is get the height that we've already worked out. We multiply that by the vertex normal of the world. So I'm going to type in vertex normal. Now, the vertex normal is essentially a direction. So if I was to look at this, you could see that there's only blue in the top half because that's pointing upwards. Whereas on the bottom half, there's no blue because it'd be a negative value because it's pointing downwards, because blue represents the z-axis. So by multiplying a direction against the height, we're effectively giving a direction distance. So it's saying push it that far out in that direction because the height value, if the height's 0, it means push it 0 values in that direction. If the height's equal to 1, it'll mean push it 1 in that direction. And I can multiply this against any number to kind of control how far it's going to push out. So if I was to multiply this number by 5, for instance, that's now going to push out a pure white value in our height map by 5 centimeters. So to do this, I'm just going to plug this into here. At which point, I'm going to have to make one other change before we see the effect. So I've applied this, and I'm now going to open up the landscape material. And I'm just going to go down my landscape material, and you'll see that there's a section that says no tessellation. Instead, set that to PN triangles. Hit apply. And now I'm going to look at this in the world. This is going to take a little longer to build. And again, this does add overhead, so it also takes a little longer to compile. But when it pops in, what we should be seeing here is, if I bring myself closer to the ground, do you see how this ground is now actually 3D? Wherever the height map was, it's now pushing those pixels up. And if I look at it from here, it actually has a whole lot more depth to it, because all of this dirt kind of far more nicely like sticks out and has some realism to it. So we want to do this for not just the ground, we also want to do it for the grass as well. But before we do, we need to remember one thing. If I go into wireframe mode, you can see the tessellation kicking in. See these extra polygons that have been spliced in? As I move away, those polygons are removed, but as I'm close, they're in there. So for this kind of thing, what we actually want to do is we want to control how these are, like how far away it is before it starts splicing in additional polygons. Because if I move forward slowly, do you see we have that effect of them shimmering as they kind of pop in? The reason for that is that if I go to here, you can see the polygons are getting more dense as they're getting into our field of view. So how we can fix this is we can tell this to do a blend further away between our two materials, and at that point we want to increase or decrease the tessellation multiplier. So what I'm going to have here is, initially I'm going to go to my landscape and I'm going to set this blend to be from 2000, and I'm just going to push it up to about 3000. I'm also going to tell it to be slightly further away, so I'm going to go from 1500 to say 1750. Now I'm going to apply that. There we go. And if I move forward, it's still there, and it's a bit better, but it's still not great. But that's okay, because there's one other fix that we can bring in to kind of fix it a bit. And that is that at the moment we're outputting to world displacement. But in this set material attributes, I'm going to add another category, which is going to be called tessellation multiplier. So for tessellation multiplier, which is there, what we need to do is we need to tell this essentially that when we're close, really tessellate it. When we're far away, don't tessellate it that much at all. So it's up to us how we want to handle that, but I find that the nicest way is actually to leverage off of this distance blend that we already have being read in. And if I get that distance blend and I increase the contrast, so a power of 3 would do. So I'm going to look at this, and you can see that it's black, it's black, it's black, and then as I get farther away, it'll do this. When we're up close and it's a value that's black, what I want to do is I want to lerp So I'm going to drop in a linear interpolate by hitting L and left clicking. Alternatively, I can type in the word linear and grab it from there. I'm going to connect this to the alpha, and I'm just going to plug this into my tessellation multiplier. And the values that I'm going to set here are going to be, when you're quite close, do a multiplier of 2. Initially, let's try a value of 0 and see how that goes on for the white values. So I've hit apply, now I'll wait. Okay, here we go, it's just popping in. And the ground around us now has a higher tessellation factor as well, because we've pushed it up to 2. So it's a little less noticeable, but it might be worthwhile us just changing that to 1 after all. So I'm going to go between 2 and 1. And I'm just going to build one last time. Significantly harder to notice in the distance now, and we're only able to spot it at all because it's on a flat surface. If this had even like a bit of hills and stuff going, it would be substantially harder to really notice, so I'll move over here. So yep, it's pretty tricky to notice, and if I come down to the ground, we've got some actual 3D like depth, so they're occluding themselves. So it looks quite nice, and it works reasonably well. So the next thing we're going to do is quickly add this to our grass as well. So I'm going to go to ML Dirt, and I'm just going to copy the set materials, the multiply, the normal, as well as this power and low. So you should have these nodes here. I'm going to Control C, quickly go into the grass, and just after everything, paste. And if you remember, we're running the material attributes into the set. And this multiply here plugs into the height. And this power plugs into the distance. Going to click apply, and we'll just have a quick test to see how that goes. Can't remember where my grass was in the map, so I'm just going to zoom out for a second until I can see it. So there's my grass over here. So we can see it's working there as well. It's not quite as smooth as we would really like it though for this grass. Ideally this grass would be in large chunks that were up, and then every now and then it dips down. So for us to do that, there's an extra operation that we can really do. So this height is currently outputting a value between 0 and 1 to here. And in the same way before that we multiplied it and then increased the contrast, we could actually just do that one extra time to get something that might look a little bit better. So I'm going to multiply this by a higher number, say 3. And after we've multiplied it by 3, I'm just going to clamp it. Now I should probably increase the contrast in the process, but to begin with I'll just clamp it. It's a little bit better. Still not great though. I might actually turn this up substantially then. So get the multiply, I'll multiply by 5. I'll increase the power to just still get those drops occasionally. If you really want to see what this is looking like, you can always turn off the UVs here and reactivate them afterwards. So I'm trying to get more of kind of a blanket white for the tessellation that then every now and then drops back. Actually 5 should be alright. And the thing that I'm also going to do here is, instead of pushing it out by 5, I'm only going to push it out by 3. I'm now going to reconnect these UVs, just because it's a bit easier to see. Apply, save. And this should be right. So after this, what we're going to be working on is foliage. And that's going to be one of the things that really brings out the life in your landscapes. So, quickly, just drop this in. That looks substantially nicer. It's got a little bit of like a depth to it. Works reasonably well. And it cleanly blends between the dirt and the grass. So the height kind of pops out depending on which layer it is. You can see the little pebbles in the distance, whereas this is kind of the block. So that works quite well. So next up, we'll be doing foliage, which is automatically added by the landscape. And then after that lesson, we'll be doing the foliage painting. So in our last lesson, we added tessellation to the landscape, but let's go through now and add foliage. Now, there are a couple of different types of foliage within Unreal. They all use instance actors, but we can actually get the landscape to automatically place foliage for us depending on certain variables, which is a really, really useful little thing. So I'm going to open up my content browser, I'm going to right click, and now I'm going to go down, and what I'm going to be adding under miscellaneous is going to be landscape grass type. So click on that, and I'm just going to call this, auto-saved, I'm just going to call this landscape plains grass. And under here we have grass varieties, so I'm going to add one. And this, from here, lets me actually set it up such that anything that is in this section can automatically be applied to any landscape layer, or in any way that I've set out. So first off, we need to select a mesh. So I'm going to go to grass mesh, and I'm going to type in grass, and I'm going to search for the word plains, and I'm going to scroll down because the one that we want is SM plains underscore grass 01. And if I look at this mesh, it just looks like this. So I've added this, and I'm also going to get my grass density, and I'm going to go from 400 down to about, let's start with a value of 15. Now this is the number of instances per 10 square meters, so this can get out of hand quite quickly if you have a big number there. Now I'm going to leave the other settings just as they are for a minute, and then I'm going to show you how they affect it once they're in the landscape itself. So we've got ourselves a landscape asset. I'm now going to go to my material, and I'm going to right click and type in grass, and you'll see that one of these says landscape grass output. Now why this is quite cool is any value that gets read into this is going to be determining where there is and isn't grass. So by clicking on this node, I'm going to say the grass type is the landscape plains grass that we just created. I'm then going to right click, and I'm going to say landscape. You see we have landscape layer blend, but we also have landscape layer sample. So add that one. Now a landscape layer sample means we can go ahead and we can get the current value of the grass, and I can say if the value is equal to 0, this is now going to have 0 grass. If the value is equal to 1, it's now going to have grass. By clicking apply and going back to my landscape, we now just wait just a second. And you'll notice that it's added all of these meshes. It's going to need to compile them first time, so give it just a moment. And you can now see that wherever we've added grass, it's gone ahead and actually placed meshes for us that are just sprawled out across the landscape. And this is really, really useful because if I go to my landscape painting now, and I click on paint, and paint a grass layer, watch what happens as I paint this in. So I can now actually paint in all of these 3D meshes that adhere to whatever it is that I've set up. And if I go back and I want to, I can actually then say, oh, let's lower the tool strength and remove a little bit of it so there's dirt patches in between. And when I come down here, you can see that those nice little patches kind of make it look substantially more realistic. So this is quite cool. One thing that I like to do here though, personally, is at the moment this is really heavily weighted so that it's more likely to have grass. If I go to my plains grass and I set my landscape, and I set the sample of the grass after it gets the value, which is a value between 0 and 1, if I get that value and I just add contrast to it, it's now going to have a little bit of green looking around the edges of the grass before it starts applying the meshes. So I'm going to hit apply. So you can now see there's a little bit of this green fading in, and the reason for that is by adding contrast, whenever the value is 1, it's still value of 1. But whenever it's 0.5, it's now 0.25. So this kind of gives us a slightly nicer blend in between the dirt and the grass itself. Now, if I open up this again, let's get this. I'm going to dock it on the right-hand side so you can see the grass that's there. So if I change this, I can now start cutting back my density. If I set this to 5, 1, we can have obviously more or less grass. But it's a good idea for us to place cull distances to sort through this, because right now if I zoom out, this grass takes quite a while before it starts to disappear. I actually personally like setting reasonably high density and then a pretty aggressive cull distance whenever my landscape isn't going to be viewed from a distance. So I'm going to set this to be between 1 and 5,000 is too high. Let's go actually between 1,000 and 10,000, and then as I move away, it's going to start culling away different bits of grass. So it'll get less and less dense, and then it'll pull them away. So 1 in 10,000 works reasonably well. The other thing that helps break this uniformity is, see where it says scale Z? I'm going to say I want every piece of grass to be a random scale between 0.8 and 1.2, which just makes every now and then it gets a little higher, a little smaller, and I personally feel it looks a lot better. Keep in mind you can crank these values up substantially if you really want to see some difference, but it's up to you. The scaling though is all set up here, so at the moment the uniform scale is X, Y, and Z. You can say free, which means the grass instances have random X, Y, and Z values. So I've applied that. Alternatively, there's also lock X and Y. So X and Y will be equal to one another, but Z will be on its own. And if I crank that up, you can now see that the Z is definitely randomly selecting. Also, I highly recommend not doing a value that high. But if I come back here, you see we have tall grass and short grass. So in this case though, I'm going to keep the values I had. 1.2 seems pretty good. And finally, to get this a little bit further, let's look at this. Let's duplicate it. And this time around, instead of adding grass, I'm going to change this mesh to say fern, and I'm just going to choose fern 1. I'm also going to drop the density. Now it's still called grass, so I'm going to drop the grass density of fern 1 to 0.1. And you can see that every now and then, it's just going to place a little fern around wherever my grass is. So we have smaller plants. So I can get this, and again, I can duplicate. And this time I can set this to fern 2. Duplicate. Fern 3. And you can see that we've got just a little bit more kind of breaking up the overall profile. So there's just random plants as I kind of move through the environment, which feels a lot nicer. So that's it. That's all it takes to get landscape grass. Next up, we're going to do painted foliage. So now that we've covered grass foliage, it's time for us to look at the regular foliage tool. Now we covered this briefly when we were doing the architectural demo, but I just want to cover it again since we are looking at outdoor landscapes, which is really where this tool was intended to be used. So within this, I'm able to open up the content browser. I'm just going to dock it to my lower panel here. And then if I want to, I can actually select any meshes. In this case, I'm going to shift select the ferns and flowers. And I can drag them into here where it says foliage type. So from this, I'm able to actually set up the densities and everything else. It's worth noting that for any of these settings that I want to keep for later use, I can also save them out as a foliage asset that I can then just drop back in to keep those settings. So if I have a particular setting that I really like for dense long grass or something like that, I might want to save it out. In this case, I'm going to set the density to be quite low. As before, it's going to be within a 10 by 10 area, so I'm going to keep it quite low for all of them since they're all being added in the same location. So 5, 5, 5, 5. So I've added all of these now, and to apply them into the game, all I need to do is left click, and you can see if I zoom in that we've got nice flowers and plants being placed in that area. I can also shift left click and remove them, Keep in mind as well that I can mix and match some of these. So if I want to turn off the plants, I can just uncheck them. And now we're only going to be planting flowers wherever I left click. The other thing that's worth noting is there's a couple of settings here that you can tinker with to kind of get the desired effect of whatever it is that you're doing. And that is that if I go to here, you can see that we've got random scaling, just as we did before. So I can set this to have any scale that we want to have, so that some flowers are taller than others, for instance. I can also set this up so that align to normal is on or off, which allows us to get the flowers to either automatically place themselves along the ground shape. See, as I paint